Reading is from Mark chapter 12, verses 38 through 44. If you'd like to follow along in your pew Bible, you can find it on page 49 in the New Testament portion. As Jesus taught, he said, "Beware of the scribes, who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. Then he called his disciples and said to them, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on." The word of the Lord. Well, if you were here last week, then you know that I had my robe cleaned and I accidentally left it hanging in my closet at home. And if I had that to do all over again, I wish it would have been this week instead of last week after that reading. It might be a lot more comfortable to preach this sermon if I weren't wearing a long robe. Today is Dedication Sunday, a day when we celebrate our gifts of time and talent, and especially treasure that we give to the church, or more accurately, to what we perceive to be God's mission in the world in this particular time and in this particular place. There will be a time later in the service for you to dedicate those commitments to God. And on the surface, our gospel reading this morning may seem like a pastor's dream passage for Dedication Sunday. I mean, a widow who gives all that she has and people giving out of their abundance. What more could a pastor ask for in a lectionary reading on a Dedication Sunday? Imagine what this church could be and do if everyone here gave all that they could. No more leaks in the ceiling, internet that works all the time, even on your cell phone, no mortgage, youth and children's programs out the wazoo with full-time staff to support them, pastoral staff available and ready for each person's beck and call, new windows in all parts of the building, and wads of cash for every outreach project. Now, as exciting as all of that may sound, a surface reading of this passage would not do it justice. If everyone really did give all that they had to live on, then, well, what would they have to live on? And I think that is more to Jesus' point this morning. After all, he sits opposite the treasury, observing everything that's happening. And I wonder if he planned it that way, knowing exactly where he was going to sit and what he was doing, intending to point out the hypocrisy that he saw in his Father's house, in his place of worship. Or did it just happen that way? Was he just tired? And so suddenly he plopped down opposite of the treasury. And he was in a position to see things from a different point of view. And he was finding himself more aware than he had ever been, noticing, perhaps for the first time, what was going on around him. And it was shocking when he took the time to notice it. And so he can't help it. He must share it with his friends, the thing that he has just discovered. He calls his disciples over, says, Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of those who are contributing to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. Perhaps he says this with a tone of realization in his voice. Perhaps he says it with sadness. Now, prior to this passage, Jesus has shared a moment of solidarity with a scribe who says to Jesus, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that God is one, and beside him there is no other. And to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, this is much more important than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices." And when Jesus saw that the scribe had answered this way, he says to the scribe, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And here we are, just 4 short verses later, and Jesus says, "Beware of the scribes." So what's going on here? See, I think these passages, they are connected. The author of Mark means for us to read them in succession, not as isolated passages, just disjoined from one another. He's trying to show us, trying to help us learn what it means for our lives to put God first. To think of everything we do, even the things that we don't want to think of having anything to do with our commitment to God, as being relevant. That includes our stewardship. If we consider our stewardship as what it means for us to say that we put God first, that everything we do, including our stewardship, is an expression of how and if we are loving God with all our heart and our understanding and our strength, then we demonstrate that by caring for one another, by making commitments to love our neighbors as ourselves. There's no doubt about it. The synagogue in Mark's case, the church in our case, needs money. We need money to function, to operate on a daily basis within our cultural expectations of our society. We need to be able to have internet, to send out emails to all of you. We need to be able to send snail mail. We need to be able to receive and call other people, to receive telephone calls. We need money to do that. We need money to be able to educate our children and youth. We need money to reach out to our communities and hold things like health fairs and garage sales. We need money even to care for one another, to visit one another in the hospital, to have receptions after memorial services. All of it, this building, requires money. And without it, so many people would be missing a sense of community, would be missing a safe place to meet. But to think of stewardship as being primarily about giving money completely misses the mark. Stewardship is also about people's lives. It is about the relationships that we have with one another. There is no mistake that both of our readings in the Old Testament and New Testament this morning are about people who depend upon the community for life and see the importance of giving back to those communities to provide life for others. As those who follow Jesus, we believe we are called to be good stewards of all that we have and all that we are. So it seems to me here that Jesus is pointing out to the disciples that the scribes have the same problem that all of us have. That even when we can verbalize the greatest commandment, even when we know it by heart and can intellectually and theologically know our purpose and our calling and our responsibilities, it is still so very, very hard not to slip into that comfortable shoe of being more concerned with what we have than how we honor God and the needs of those around us. When we look at stewardship, we often think, how are we going to be better off next year than we are right now? What am I going to get out of this pledge, this gift, this offering? How is the church going to meet my needs? We may also think of how we're going to reach out to our community and provide for others, but that often comes as an afterthought. First, how are we going to take care of ourselves? And then, with what's left over, how will we care for others? And so Jesus realizes, notices, points out that that's not how God intended us to think. In the stories of creation, we affirm that God intends us to be in relationship with God, with the world, with each other. When we look at the Ten Commandments and when we look at the law, we see that they're there to help us understand what God intends us to do for God and for our neighbors. And not only that, but also to know that God intends others to do these things for us. So we're called to be involved in mutual relationship. These aren't just rules that dictate what we should and should not do. They are commandments that help us know how to honor God and care for one another at the same time that they show us how God and others are intended to care for us. We're not called to be isolated individuals. From the very beginning, God calls us to community. To be a group of people gathered and bound together by mutual need and caring. Now, regarding stewardship, this means that we're not just called to search our hearts in private and prayerfully consider all alone how much we are willing to give. Rather, as a community, we search together to strive to understand together how well our commitments reflect our understanding of our call to hear and live in ways that demonstrate that we love the Lord our God with all our heart and with all our soul and with all our mind and with all our strength. And how well then we strive to love our neighbors as ourselves. Jesus is sitting opposite the treasury, and he dares to notice that what is happening in the temple, in his Father's house, does not add up with what God intends for God's community. And so he calls his disciples over, and he says, here's what I see. Here's what I notice. Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in far more than all of them who have contributed to the treasury. For all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. He dares them to notice if they think that's okay. Does such a thing reflect who God intends God's community to be? Does what we do here in this place reflect the character of the congregation that we believe ourselves to be? Now, I admit, this is a difficult way to read this text. It indicts us all. It makes us think about stewardship in ways that are really uncomfortable. I know I'm not comfortable as I stand here in my long robe, about to sit down on a pew behind me that's on a level that's elevated above the floor on which you all sit, and knowing that in a few minutes I'm going to ask you to come forward and put your commitment cards into a basket and dedicate them and commit them to God. This passage invites us to think about many things as we do that. And I've been searching for the good news in all of this, and I think that maybe, just maybe, if we remember who we are and who God intends us to be, and that we are called to be stewards, not only of ourselves, but of each other, each one of us committed to the welfare and the well-being of the rest of the community, committed to demonstrating that we strive to put God first, then maybe what we do here together today will be a true expression and celebration of our stewardship and our belief that we can experience again and anew God's blessing in us and through this community of faith together. So later today, when we bring those commitment cards forward, I dare you to notice the community around you and imagine how we might strive to live into our calling of who God intends us to be. Amen.